A sudden, piercing scream echoed across the quiet neighborhood as Sarah stumbled back from her phone, eyes wide with disbelief. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The numbers on the screen didn't lie. The vacation home she had just bought was a scam. Her dream of owning a beautiful house by the beach had become a nightmare in a blink of an eye. The sleek website, with its glossy photos and sweet promises, had led her straight into a trap. Sarah had given her life savings to someone she thought she could trust, someone who promised everything and delivered nothing. She sank to the ground, the weight of betrayal crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Behind her, the sound of a car pulling up signaled the arrival of her husband, Mark Dido. He entered, unaware of the storm that was brewing in his wife's heart. Sarah stood, breathless, her eyes filled with unspeakable fury as she shoved the phone into his hands. Mark's face drained of color as he scanned the screen, the same realization dawning upon him. The truth was out, and there was no going back. They had been played, and their future had just been stolen from under their noses. Mark's hand clenched around the phone, his knuckles white. He couldn't look away, the gravity of the situation sinking in slowly. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah, standing beside him, stared at the ground, the weight of her broken trust crushing her. Mark turned to her, desperation in his eyes. "Sarah, we've been scammed. All our savings, gone." She didn't reply, her lips trembling as she fought to hold back tears. The silence in the room was suffocating, and every second felt like it was being stretched out, pulling them further into the abyss. Mark's gaze flicked to the window, where the late afternoon sun was slipping away, turning the sky into a deep, unsettling shade of orange. He felt numb. The life they had imagined, vacation weekends in a dream house by the beach, was slipping through his fingers like sand. How could we have been so blind, he asked, though he knew the answer. They had trusted too easily, believed the lies, and now it was too late. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the phone again, the screen still open to the confirmation email. "I don't know," she whispered, barely able to speak the words. "I really thought it was real." The silence between them grew unbearable, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Mark stood frozen, his hand still clutching the phone, as if it might suddenly reveal a way out of the nightmare. Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to push back the tears, but they came anyway, hot and uncontrollable. "How could we have been so naive?" she murmured. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. The trust they had placed in this scammer, someone who had promised them everything, now lay in ruins. He dropped onto the couch, exhausted from the weight of the revelation. Sarah remained standing, pacing in tight circles, unable to keep still. She had always believed in the good in people, in the fairness of the world. But now, all those beliefs felt shattered, like glass falling to the floor, impossible to piece together again. The scammer had been so convincing, their words so smooth. Sarah had been lured in by promises of luxury, by a dream that felt too good to be true, but she had wanted to believe. She had wanted to live in that dream. She sank into the chair beside Mark, her head in her hands. "We've lost everything," she said, the finality of it sinking deep into her chest. After a long pause, Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaky but determined. "We can't just let this go. We need to do something." Mark turned to her, his eyes bloodshot, the exhaustion weighing on him. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice almost hollow. "Call the police? Report a scam that we willingly fell for?" He let out a bitter laugh, a sound that felt foreign coming from him. Sarah's lips trembled as she stood up again, walking toward the window. She stared out, her eyes focused on nothing, just a blank stare into the horizon. "We have to fight back," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I won't let them get away with this. I won't be another victim." Mark's gaze softened as he watched her, the flicker of determination in her voice sparking something inside him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break through the fog of disbelief. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steadying. "We'll fight back." The camera lingered on Sarah's face, capturing her resolve, the soft light of the setting sun reflecting off her features. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The next morning, Sarah and Mark sat at the kitchen table, papers and notes scattered around them, their plans slowly taking shape. They were both exhausted, but there was a quiet sense of purpose in the air now, something that had been missing the day before. "We'll start with the website," Sarah said, tapping her fingers on the paper. "We have to trace it back, find out who is behind it." Mark nodded, his hand hovering over the keyboard as he began typing. "We'll get our money back, we have to." But even as he said the words, part of him knew that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something much deeper, his pride, his trust, and his belief in a world that was suddenly much darker than he had ever imagined. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the house they had dreamed of, the life they had imagined. The images now felt so far away, like a distant memory of a life that could have been. She wiped her eyes again, frustrated with herself for letting her guard down, for not seeing it coming. But there was no time for self-pity. They had a fight ahead of them, and it was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. It had been a week since the discovery, and Sarah and Mark were no closer to finding out who was behind the scam. They'd tried every lead, made countless calls, but each attempt felt like a dead end. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his phone in his hand, scrolling through pages of online forums, while Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the city. The pain of losing their hard-earned savings still weighed heavily on her, but there was something else, an unsettling feeling that they were being watched. She couldn't shake the thought that the scammer was still out there somewhere, planning their next move. "We're getting closer," Mark said, his voice almost distant as he clicked through another web page. Sarah turned toward him, her eyes narrowed. "Are we, or are we just chasing shadows?" Mark didn't reply, but the tension in his posture said everything. They were both trapped in a race against time, with no idea who their real enemy was. The sense of helplessness hung thick in the air. It was as if they were standing at the edge of something, unable to move forward or back. "We'll figure this out," Mark said finally, but even his words didn't carry the same conviction they once had. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the fear in her chest kept her from fully trusting it. As the days passed, Sarah's frustration grew. The lead they were following had led to another dead end, and she was beginning to feel like they were running in circles. Her trust in the system, everything she thought she understood about justice, was starting to unravel. Mark had always been the optimist, the one who believed in second chances and fresh starts. But even his optimism was beginning to fade. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Sarah turned to him, her voice sharp. "You know, I'm starting to think that we'll never get our money back. And what's worse, I think we've been set up. Someone's watching us." Mark looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, the hint of concern evident in his voice. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But I feel it. Every time I check the mail, every time I leave the house, it's like someone's right behind me, waiting for me to slip up." Mark didn't reply immediately. The unease was palpable, and Sarah could see it in his face. He hadn't noticed it before, but now he did. They weren't just victims, they were targets. The next day they decided to take a different approach. Mark had found a private investigator who specialized in online fraud. Sarah was reluctant, but desperation had set in, and they needed answers. They met with the investigator at a small cafe on the corner of their street. The investigator, a grizzled man in his late 40s named Jack, sat across from them, his steely blue eyes sharp as he listened to their story. "You're not the only ones," he said, his voice low. "There's a whole network of scammers like this. They've been running this for years, and most people never find out until it's too late." Sarah felt her stomach twist at his words. Mark, however, seemed to take comfort in the fact that they weren't alone. Jack leaned in, his fingers tapping on the table. "I'll need all the information you have. Every email, every phone call, every detail. They leave traces, you just need to know where to look." Sarah nodded, feeling the first spark of hope in days. For the first time since the scam, she felt like there was a chance. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Nothing ever was. Over the next few days they worked with Jack to dig deeper into the scam. Every lead brought them closer, but each discovery only opened up more questions. It wasn't just the vacation homes, it was part of a much larger scheme, one that seemed to stretch across the country. Mark was glued to his phone, making calls, following up on every detail Jack had asked for. Sarah, on the other hand, started to question everything: their savings, their dream, even their relationship with the scammer. What had she missed? What red flags had she ignored? She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of their loss pressing down on her chest. Mark would sometimes catch her staring, but he didn't ask her what was wrong. They had grown used to the silence, to the quiet tension that had replaced their once carefree conversations. One evening, Sarah received a strange call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, but the voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "We know you're looking," the voice said, its tone cold and menacing. "You'll never find him. You'll never get your money back." The call ended abruptly. Sarah sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind racing. They weren't just dealing with a scammer, they were dealing with someone who had eyes everywhere. The days blended into one another, each bringing a new wave of frustration. Sarah and Mark felt like they were living in a fog. Constant worry, constant movement, but no clear end in sight. They had no choice but to keep going, even when every new lead seemed to slip through their fingers. The call had rattled Sarah, but it had also ignited something in her. She wasn't about to back down, not after everything they had been through. "We can't stop now," she said one evening, her voice steady, filled with determination. "We've come too far." Mark nodded in agreement, though his weariness was evident. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Jack continued to feed them information, but it was like trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. One thing became clear: this scam was bigger than they had imagined. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. But they couldn't quit. Not now. Sarah looked at Mark, the quiet resolve in her eyes matching his. They were in this together, and together they would find the truth. It had been 2 weeks since they started working with Jack, and Sarah felt like they were no closer to the truth. Every lead they pursued seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. The scam was vast, stretching far beyond what they had imagined. Mark's optimism had begun to wear thin, and Sarah found herself questioning everything. They had uncovered dozens of fake identities, dozens of false companies, but no real answers. Sitting in their small living room late one night, Mark closed his laptop, rubbing his eyes. "We're not getting anywhere," he said, his voice strained. Sarah didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. She was tired too, tired of waiting for justice, tired of hoping for an answer that seemed increasingly out of reach. "I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched," Sarah admitted, breaking the silence. Mark looked at her, his expression hardening. "You're not the only one," he said. For the first time since the scam began, the reality of their situation seemed to hit them both at once. They weren't just victims anymore. They were targets in a game they didn't understand, and whoever was pulling the strings had the power to make them disappear without a trace. The next morning, Sarah received another call. This time it was from an unknown number, but she didn't hesitate to answer. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, and menacing. "You're getting too close," the voice warned. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let the fear show in her voice. "Who is this?" she demanded. The voice only chuckled before hanging up. Sarah stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind racing. Mark entered the room just as she lowered the phone. "Who was that?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. The message was clear. Someone was watching them, and they weren't about to let them find out the truth. "We need to be more careful," Sarah said, her voice low. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll be careful, but we're not stopping," he said with quiet resolve. They had come too far to turn back now. The scam had taken everything from them, and they weren't going to let it go without a fight. With the threat lingering over them, Sarah and Mark decided to meet with Jack again. This time they were more cautious, taking different routes to the meeting place, and watching for any signs of being followed. Jack's office was in a nondescript building downtown, hidden in the maze of offices. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from Jack's cigarette, the smell lingering in the stale air. "They know you're looking," Jack said bluntly as he lit another cigarette. "And they don't like it. You need to be careful who you trust." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "What do you know about them?" she demanded. Jack paused, exhaling smoke slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Enough to know that they won't hesitate to get rid of you if they think you're a threat." Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah. It was the first time they had heard anything concrete, but it raised more questions than answers. "We need more," Mark said. "How do we take them down?" Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between them. "You keep pushing, and you keep your eyes open. But be ready for anything. They're dangerous." The next few days were filled with a growing sense of urgency. Jack's warning had lit a fire under them, and they dove into their investigation with renewed determination. Every new lead seemed to reveal even more sinister connections, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something big. But as the days passed, the threats grew more frequent. Their phones rang in the middle of the night, with nothing but silence on the other end. Strange cars parked near their apartment, and someone was always watching from across the street. Mark started to carry a small pistol with him when he left the house, and Sarah kept a pair of scissors in her bag. They had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. "I'm not scared," Sarah said one evening, looking at Mark as they sat at the kitchen table. "I'm angry." Mark nodded, his expression hard. "Good," he said. "Use that anger. We'll take them down." As the days turned into weeks, the investigation seemed to lead nowhere, and Sarah's hope began to fade. They had uncovered pieces of the puzzle, but the final piece still eluded them. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in their apartment, staring at the wall, Mark entered with a strange look on his face. "I think we found something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. Sarah turned to him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Mark placed a folder on the table, its contents filled with photographs, documents, and names. "We've been following the wrong trail," he said, his voice steady now. "The scam goes deeper than we thought. This is just the beginning." Sarah's eyes widened as she flipped through the papers. The name at the top of one document caught her attention. It was a name she recognized, someone they had trusted. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a scam. It was a conspiracy, and they had been right in the middle of it all along. The discovery they had made felt like a cold slap to their faces. The conspiracy went deeper than Sarah and Mark could have imagined. The name they had found in the files, the one they had once trusted, was a lead that shattered everything. Sarah couldn't believe it. The person they had considered a friend was connected to the scam. How had they not seen it sooner? It was all so clear now, the subtle hints, the inconsistencies in the stories they had been told. But it wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated move. They had been pawns in a much larger game. Mark paced the room, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "We need to confront them," he said, his voice low and steady. Sarah, still staring at the documents, felt a mix of disbelief and rage. "We don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. This ends now." They had no idea how far the reach of the scam went, or how many more people were involved. But one thing was clear. They couldn't let this go on any longer. They had been deceived, and now it was time to take matters into their own hands. The fight was just beginning. The decision was made. They had to confront the person who had betrayed them. They arranged a meeting at a local cafe, a neutral place where they could talk without drawing too much attention. The atmosphere in the cafe was tense as they waited for the individual to arrive. Sarah's stomach churned with anticipation. She hadn't been this angry in a long time. Mark sat across from her, his face set in determination. "This isn't going to be easy," he said. Sarah nodded, her fingers drumming on the table. "I know, but it has to be done." When the person finally arrived, their face was calm, almost too calm. They slid into the chair across from Sarah and Mark, giving them a look of recognition, but no hint of guilt. "I didn't expect to see you here," they said, their voice smooth, almost too smooth. Sarah's heart raced as she leaned in, her eyes cold. "You thought we wouldn't find out?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. The individual remained silent for a moment before speaking, their tone dismissive. "You've gotten too close, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." The confrontation was colder than Sarah had anticipated. The betrayer's calm demeanor only fueled her anger. "You don't get to just walk away from this," Sarah said, her voice low but sharp. The individual smirked. "What do you think you're going to do? Expose me? Do you really think anyone will believe you?" The words stung, but Sarah didn't let them show. "We already have the evidence," she said. Mark stood up from the table, his fists clenched. "This doesn't end here," he said. "You've taken everything from us, and now we're taking back what's ours." The betrayer's expression shifted slightly, but they remained seated, calculating their next move. "You don't know who you're dealing with," they said, the arrogance in their voice still apparent. "But you'll learn soon enough." Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, their resolve hardening. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice. And they weren't backing down. After the meeting, Sarah and Mark were left with more questions than answers. The betrayer's words echoed in their minds. "You don't know who you're dealing with." What did that mean? Who else was involved in this? They spent the rest of the evening piecing together what they knew, but the puzzle was far from complete. The next day, Jack called them with new information. "I've been looking into things," he said, his voice serious. "There's a much larger operation here. You've only scratched the surface." Sarah felt her stomach drop. It wasn't just a scam. It was an entire network of deceit, and they were now in the middle of it. "We need to move faster," Mark said, his voice grim. "This is getting bigger than we ever imagined." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. They had no choice but to keep pushing, even if they didn't know who else was involved. Their pursuit of justice had just become a dangerous game, and they were now more committed than ever to seeing it through. As Sarah and Mark dug deeper, the threats grew more intense. Their phones were hacked, their emails were compromised. It was clear now, they were being watched every step of the way. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the apartment, a sudden knock at the door made her heart race. She opened it cautiously, only to find a package left on the doorstep. She brought it inside, her hands shaking. The contents were chilling, photographs of Sarah and Mark, taken from outside their apartment, showing them in moments of vulnerability. The message was clear: they were being watched, and they had no control over how deep this conspiracy went. Mark returned home to find Sarah holding the photographs, her face pale with shock. "We have to stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark looked at her, his face set in grim determination. "No," he said firmly. "We've come too far. We're going to end this." The day had come. Sarah and Mark stood on the threshold of the final confrontation. They had gathered all the evidence they could find, piecing together the truth bit by bit. But the time for investigation was over. Now, they had to face the person behind it all. Mark checked the gun in his coat pocket once more, his nerves raw. He had never imagined that their pursuit of justice would lead them to this point, standing face to face with the mastermind, knowing the danger that awaited them. Sarah was a different person now. The anger and pain from the past weeks had sharpened her resolve. She no longer saw herself as a victim. She saw herself as someone who would take control of her life once more. "This ends today," Sarah said, her voice firm. Mark nodded, but his mind was racing. They knew this confrontation could go sideways, that they might not come out of it alive. But they couldn't turn back now. They had lost too much, and they couldn't let the scammer destroy any more lives. They were ready to face whatever came next. They approached the building cautiously, each step bringing them closer to the unknown. The door swung open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The silence was suffocating, but Sarah couldn't back down now. They had been lured here, knowing that this was where everything would either end or spiral into chaos. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Mark asked quietly, his voice tinged with apprehension. Sarah took a deep breath, nodding. "We don't have a choice," she replied. They stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a faint echo. The room ahead was bathed in shadows, with only a single desk lamp casting a dull glow. Sitting at the desk was their enemy, the person who had orchestrated everything, the one who had destroyed their lives for profit. The betrayer looked up as they entered, a cold smile spreading across their face. "I knew you'd come," they said, their voice laced with mockery. "But you're too late. It's over." The confrontation was everything they had feared and more. The betrayer didn't flinch as they leaned back in their chair, eyes glinting with amusement. "You think you can take me down?" the betrayer said, their voice dripping with arrogance. "I've built this empire, you're nothing but small players." Sarah stepped forward, her fists clenched. "You took everything from us," she said, her voice steady but filled with rage. "You manipulated us, used us for your own gain, and now you'll pay." Mark stood beside her, his jaw set. "We're not leaving here without justice," he added. The betrayer's smirk faltered, just for a second. "You think you're the first to try and stop me?" they sneered. "You're nothing. No one will believe you." Sarah's eyes burned with fury. "It's over," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with certainty. "You're done." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Then the betrayer's face twisted into a snarl. "You really think you can beat me?" they spat. "I've got more power than you'll ever understand." Sarah's mind raced, but she stood her ground. Mark took a step forward, his voice low but unwavering. "We've already won. The truth is out, and no matter what you say, you're finished." The betrayer's expression darkened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," they said, their voice cold. But Sarah could see it in their eyes. Fear. They had underestimated her and Mark. The game had changed. With the evidence they had collected, they could destroy the betrayer's empire. They had won. It wasn't over yet, but the end was near. The betrayer's mask was slipping, and they knew it. The betrayer's final attempts to talk their way out of it were futile. The truth had already been exposed, and nothing could stop the tide of justice from sweeping over them. As Sarah and Mark walked out of the building, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. They had won. The scam was over, but the scars it had left would never truly heal. As they walked down the dark street, Sarah turned to Mark. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but full of relief. Mark nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, we did." The city around them seemed quieter now, the looming darkness no longer a threat but a reminder of how far they had come. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt free. Sarah and Mark sat in the quiet of their apartment, staring at the evidence they had gathered over the past weeks. The fight was over, the scammer was exposed. But something still gnawed at them. The sense of relief was bittersweet. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with doubt. Mark, sitting across from her, let out a sigh. "I don't know. It feels like it should be, but there's a part of me that thinks we've just uncovered a piece of something much bigger." They had lost so much: money, time, trust, and yet, as the walls of their apartment seemed to close in on them, Sarah realized that they were both changed. This experience had forged a new kind of resilience in them, but it also left deep scars. Mark met her gaze. "No matter what happens, we've done something most people wouldn't even dream of. We've faced the truth." Sarah nodded, her eyes firm. "And we're not done yet. We'll make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The truth was out, but their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. A week later, Sarah received a call from a journalist who had been following the case. They wanted to hear her side of the story, the truth behind the scam. Sarah hesitated. The public exposure would be inevitable, but it felt like they had no choice. "Are you ready for this?" Mark asked, his voice steady. Sarah exhaled, looking out the window at the city. I don't know if anyone can ever be ready for something like this, she replied. But we can't hide from it anymore. People need to know. They had lived in the shadows for too long, but now, it was time to step into the light. Mark gave her a reassuring look. We're doing the right thing. Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. The truth had to be told. She had been manipulated, but now she had control. And she would make sure no one else would fall victim to the same trap. The interview was scheduled, and as Sarah sat in front of the camera, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life would never be the same. The journalist asked questions, probing, trying to understand how someone like her had become a victim. It's easy to get caught up in something that seems too good to be true, Sarah said, her voice steady. I wanted to believe in the dream they sold me. I never thought it would be my downfall. The questions came faster, but Sarah kept her composure. I think that's what happens to most people. You trust, you hope, and before you know it, you're trapped. She paused, the weight of her words settling in. But I won't stay trapped. I'm not that person anymore. The camera kept rolling, but Sarah didn't look away. She was reclaiming her story, one sentence at a time. The interview aired, and as Sarah watched the footage, she felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Her story was out there, for the world to see. Mark sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. You did good, he said, his voice soft but full of pride. Sarah nodded, her gaze still fixed on the screen. It's not about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by this. Mark looked at her, a hint of concern in his eyes. Are you okay? He asked. Sarah's eyes met his, her lips pressing into a smile. Yeah, I think I am. The weight of their journey hadn't disappeared, but now it felt lighter. They had done the right thing. And while the scars would remain, Sarah knew she had reclaimed her power. We won, she said softly. We'll keep fighting for the truth. Weeks passed, and the aftermath of their decision to go public started to settle. The scam was exposed, and the authorities were involved, but Sarah and Mark knew the fight wasn't over. The damage had been done, and now they were left to rebuild. I'm proud of us, Mark said one evening as they sat together, a quiet sense of peace between them. Sarah smiled, her eyes softening. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, she admitted. But we're okay. We're stronger than we were before. The city outside their windows seemed less daunting now, the weight of their past no longer hanging over them. They had survived the storm. And while they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they were ready for whatever came next. Together they had faced the truth, and together they would move forward. Sarah and Mark reflect on their journey. Despite the victory, they realize the scars remain, but they've taken back control. Mark reassures Sarah, and they agree that they've changed but remain strong. The fight may be over, but the future is uncertain. Sarah contemplates their past and Mark supports her as they prepare to move forward. The decision to rebuild their lives starts with small steps like taking a trip to the mountains. It's not a dream home, but it's a new beginning. After the trip, they return to normal life and become advocates, warning others about scams. Sarah starts a blog and Mark supports her. Their recovery continues as they share their story to help others. Years later, Sarah and Mark are content, having rebuilt their lives. They reflect on the past and realize the strength they gained. Together, they now face the future with hope, knowing their story has reshaped them. In their quiet moment, Sarah and Mark acknowledge their shared resilience. They've overcome their past struggles and look ahead with pride and hope. The journey of rebuilding continues, but they're ready for whatever comes next.